We can speak now to Nick Freeman. Now, he's a Manchester-based solicitor. He's also known as Mr. Loophole, bit of an expert in cases like this. Morning, Nick.
Morning, Chelsea.
I've been dying to speak to you this morning because this is something that really is close to my heart. I mean, I think if I break the law, if I know I'm doing something wrong, then I pay the fine. But there are increasingly grey areas and sort of times when we park and we feel we've been misled, in which I feel that, in those situations, we should have the right to argue them. Would you kind of echo that?
Well, of course you do have the right to argue them. And there's certainly a case of car parks trying to bully people and tempt them into taking the least line of resistance, and that's why they say, well, it's a £100 fine, but look, if you pay within 14 days, we'll knock it down to £60. And most people are too busy, they don't want the stress, they feel it's an intimidatory process, and they just roll over and pay the money on many occasions when they shouldn't. And I think what's important, for the first thing about White City is, well, those signs must be displayed upon entry. So when you're entering the car park, the land's obviously owned by somebody. It's private land. It's owned by someone, and it's right that they charge. But their terms and conditions must be clearly, unambiguously displayed. So when you enter, you know exactly what you're involving yourself with. Now, I don't know where the signs are. I know there are signs on White City. I don't know where those signs are, and I am aware that there's a huge problem in exiting the retail park, and there are huge delays, and I think this is what's causing a lot of the problem, which I can talk about if you like.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it right then? Because I've recently challenged one of these, and actually I was successful because I asked them to prove that I was parked for the entire time and not waiting for a space or queuing to get out. Is it that the clock starts on entry and on exit, and then you should add those on to the time that you're parked, so to speak?
Yes. There's a fault with this system because they are parking restrictions. They're not driving in and driving out restrictions. And the way this retail park is set up, like many others, is it times you from moment of entry to moment of exit. And that, of course, does not involve all the time that you're parked. So some people are involved in lengthy delays when they're queuing, having removed their vehicle from their parking space. They're no longer parking. They're no longer in breach of conditions. But the car park, the owners of the car park, are unable to differentiate whether you're actually still parked or whether you're in a queue.
So if you challenge them using that, would you get away with it then?
Well, you will get away with it, of course, because you're not parking. But I think we ought to remember the land's owned by someone, and we all have to say, look, it's right that you pay a fair and reasonable price for parking on their land. What we don't want people doing is saying, and the system is obviously open to abuse, is people will say, well, look, I was queuing for a long time when in fact they weren't.
Yeah.
If you've overstayed your parking period, that's your problem and you should pay the fine. If you haven't and you're in a queue, you should notify them straight away. And I would imagine that they would say, yes, fair enough, we can't prove to the contrary, and we'll capitulate and won't pursue the matter.
And if they don't?
It costs them money to pursue it as well. And ultimately, you end up in court, and a court's going to hear, well, I was in a queue of traffic, I'd parked there for an hour and a half, and then I was queuing for an hour to get out, and it was a match day, and it's 90 minutes, and I've done nothing wrong, and do you think I'm going to waste this time? And I also would write a letter, there's a process which you go through to deal with this.
Is this the popular process as well?
Yes, there is that process, but I always think it's an idea just to write a letter to the chief executive of the company explaining what happens, in addition to the more formal legal process, so that someone can take a view. And they've got it there in black and white, what your position is, and that position will remain consistent all the way through, unless they decide, as I say, to capitulate and say, look, we're not pursuing this anymore. On many, many occasions, when people actually challenged these parking tickets and these PCNs, they abandon them, they don't pursue it because it's not worth their while, and they realise on many occasions they're wrong, and on many occasions in White City they are wrong. The problem with White City is it's the ingress and egress. It's very difficult because of the amount of traffic. Many other retail parks don't have the same problem, and I know there are major supermarkets who operate in exactly the same way, but the queues might involve a minute or 2 minutes wait. So it doesn't really raise its head.
We had a gentleman called Alex on before, and he'd successfully challenged a company. When I say successful, once he challenged them, they actually just never replied, and it was about 2 years ago. He said that if you go into a car park like this White City one, where you don't have to pay and display as such, because there is no loss, they cannot charge you, and that you should ignore it. But I remember a very famous case a few years ago which sort of said that we shouldn't be ignoring these private ones anymore.
Of course you should. That's total nonsense. If I say to you, look, if I live near the ground and I say, look, you can park on my private driveway, and I'm going to charge you £1 for the match, that's a perfectly legitimate agreement. It's a contract. You when you enter their private land, you are agreeing their reasonable terms, as long as they're unambiguous, as long as they're clearly displayed, and of course as long as you're aware of what those terms are. By driving in, you're deemed to be accepting them, and that has to be right, doesn't it? You can't just park your car wherever you want on someone else's land and say, I don't have to pay for it because it's private land. It's a ridiculous thing, and he may have been fortunate. There may well have been other reasons why it wasn't pursued, but his view of the law, I'm afraid, is not accurate, and I wouldn't want your listeners to adopt that approach.
Well, that's what we wanted to know.
Ultimately, they'll have the bailiffs knocking the door down.
So in other words, so don't ignore, but if you feel there is adequate reason, do challenge.
Yeah, if you feel wronged, if you feel, look, I really didn't know, go back and have a look. Where are the signs? Are they clear? Could you see them? And if not, that's the problem of the private car park, the people who are looking after the car park, and you should challenge it, because as I say, they should be there when you enter. Big, bold signs. Parking free for 3 hours, match days 90 minutes, and so you know what you're letting yourself in for. And if those signs aren't clear, or if it's ambiguous, then you should challenge them.
Nick, I love that. Thank you very much for clearing it up. Lovely to talk to you as ever. Nick Freeman there, also known as Mr. Loophole. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chelsea. Bye-bye.